The Giant Killers by Conway Fitzgerald. Chapter 24.
My brother grows impatient with your presence, Kaylee said, tracing her fingers into the defined muscles of Dan's chest.
Why don't you talk to him? Aren't you supposed to be in charge around here?
Perhaps not for long. She pouted, then smiled mischievously as she climbed atop him again. She then dropped her body onto him and rested her warm lips on his left ear so she could whisper. They all want me dead, especially Dalish. Dan turned his head to her as he spoke out loud.
Your brother wants you dead?
She covered his mouth with her hands. They've arranged a meeting at Didak, a parley. The other house intends to speak of truce and blaming you and your friends for these recent troubles. Dan turned to her angrily. His eyes squinted, and he grit his teeth as he spoke.
You're gonna let them make a deal with Quel?
Dan Loud whispered. Of course not. Kaylee responded with a wry smile. I'm going to get close enough, with you by my side, when we're within an arm's reach of that dark summoner. Then I want you to charge him and kill him. With him dead, and my forces in combat with his, in the chaos of battle, you can also kill Dalish.
I'm a warrior, not an assassin,
Dan responded coldly. Kaylee replied slowly and seductively. You are a lightning bolt of pure vengeance, come to strike down with great power and fury. For fury you must have. Fury you must be, if you expect to defeat the Scorned Scepter. She then looked to him for reassurance. You can defeat him, can't you?
Just get me in range of him, and you'll see. I've been waiting for this for a long time.
Yes, she agreed. The time has come, my love. Dan squinted again at her last two words.
As for your brother, well, noted,
he said. You see, this way, if you fail, I can still deny I ever knew your intentions. So tell no one of your intentions.
Who the hell am I going to tell? Besides, I won't fail,
Dan replied boldly. Good, she smiled. The next day, Dan was fitted with a new helmet to complete his new disguise as Kaylee's shield man. With his newly fashioned dark armor and his face covered, Kaylee expected to have Dan stand beside her throughout, as an expected, though unidentified, right-hand warrior. As the reigning high priestess and matriarch of the house of Zy'stiri, she was the ranking member of the Drow delegation. King Zerlus, of course, along with a pack of his personal hellhounds, and at least 40 of his best fire giant guardsmen, would represent the giants of Zy'stiri. They met at the ruins of the first Dark Tower. After the mountain giants stepped on it, most of the dirt, wood framing, fragmented rocks, and cemented pieces of the pile were blasted away in large chunks, sometimes for miles. That's when Didak was reopened, and when Quel, now the Dark Summoner, took on his new title. Now, all that was visible was a giant gaping hole in the ground. It reeked of death and pulsed with evil. Once again, Dan could feel the immediate effects of the place on his spirit. He was irritable, then anxious, and never more eager for a fight. Dan noticed the approaching giants were also agitated. They swatted at Quel's gathering Gnoll army, whose pure nature of chaos Quel preferred to that of the orcs. The Gnoll army had swollen to over 1,000 strong, and the cackling Gnolls only moved aside to allow the approach of the giants and Drow into Didak. Then they encircled around them. From out of the hole in the ground came Quel and his remaining loyal henchmen. They waited atop the dais, the only visible aspect of Didak to anyone outside. Dalish, who had brokered this meeting, stepped forward to greet Quel first. This was already a slap in the face to his sister, who was the matriarch. Kaylee had told Dan not to hesitate, The less time that was afforded for counsel and debate, the better. Kaylee and Dan reached the platform. It was a downward drawbridge that folded out of the ground like a mechanical tongue. As they made steps down the path to the first dais, where Quel and his entourage waited, the pace of their downhill steps picked up naturally. When Dan felt himself at almost 10 strides away, he broke into a full sprint towards Quel and drew his giant slayer. Dalish turned to him angrily, with his arms extended.
"No, you fool! This is a parley!"
he said in a language unknown to Dan. But Dan still knew what he was saying and didn't care. He slashed him across the neck and then used his giant strength to thrust him over the bridge and down into the dark, cavernous abyss below. Quel's men stepped back as Dan approached. Quel held aloft the scorned scepter. Kaylee yelled something as she ran behind him, presumably to feign agony over losing her brother.
"Who dares?"
shouted Quel.
I do.
Yelled Dan as he leapt up and over the sacrificial altar. Dan landed down upon Quel with a vicious downward strike. Quel managed to lift the heavy scorn scepter up to defend in time. Dan's blow was powerful, forcing the cleric back, but the scorn scepter absorbed most of the tremendous power Dan had mustered. Dan was surprised that such a strike wouldn't have cut Quel in half, let alone not even knock him down. But he noticed Quel was a bit phased and looking for aid from his guards who approached from behind. The fire giants became incensed by the outbreak of hostility and immediately started killing gnolls and other beasts of Didak in earnest. Kaylee approached from behind Dan and torched Quel's charging bodyguards with a massive fireball. They plummeted below into the abyss, burning and screaming as they fell.
"You whore! This is your doing."
Quel was outraged by Kaylee's treacherous attack. As Quel turned his attention to her, Dan took the initiative and struck at Quel's exposed knee and followed up with a shot to his chest, just missing a kill shot to the neck. Quel swung the scorn scepter furiously, smashing the ground beneath them as he missed. Quel then gathered his demonic strength and swung with another deliberate attack, which normally Dan would defend easily. Blocking such a blatant swinging strike would open up the attacker to a simple turn and slash, followed by a piercing kill shot. In those micro moments that only a master swordsman can know, Dan readied himself instinctively for his next move. Except Scorn's scepter blew right past Dan's parry, smashing through his great giant-slaying sword and striking him like a storm giant's fist on his left shoulder. The pain Dan felt was extraordinary. His sword was shattered. He dropped it, and the hilt and sword shards fell with him, to his knees in agony. He could no longer find the strength to hold up his shield. His left arm had already gone gray and had become useless. It had started withering. Dan was in shock by the incredible pain. Quel smiled through his helmet's face slits. He then approached Dan, who knelt on the ground before him.
"Now, you will know true pain."
Quel then raised the scorn scepter high for a final killing strike. But Kaylee flew in and then teleported Dan away. Dan howled in pain as Kaylee removed his tightly fitting armor. Her initial attempts at simple healing on his shoulder wound were met with supernatural resistance and eventual failure. His arm was turning grayer quickly, and the wound on his shoulder opened and leaked acid, almost like a second mouth, sizzling his flesh. Kaylee acted quickly because she did not have much time. She was familiar with a similar type of anti-healing magic, but was unsure if it would apply to this wound. But she had no other choice. "Folic flowers and fungal spores, mashed temperum root," she yelled frantically at her gathering servants, who then started racing at her insistence to gather the components in the laboratory. Dan yelled in pain as Kaylee searched through her library until she dragged out her massive tome of ancient Drow healing arts. She was sure she had seen it done before, but she had never performed it. If she didn't do it quickly, The effects of the withering would be irreversible. Like Quel, Dan would be down to one arm. That's if he even survived. She flung open the dust-covered book, which hadn't been opened in a century or more, and scanned hastily past a page regarding the druidic acts of tree growth, and then speed-read to the reversible, the drow art of withering. Then she whispered the semantics to herself. Dan howled in pain further as the servants came in with her requested elements. "Crush them together," she yelled. They reached for a mortar and pestle and mashed the ingredients together crudely. Kaylee grabbed some spark rocks and added them in, which caused the mixture to sizzle, smoke, and crackle with light. She grabbed the bowl from the servants and finished the mixture herself as she spoke the incantations. Her hand burned as she applied the hastily assembled paste into the gushing, acid-filled wound. "Tam, Suri, Zuhal, Ditala!" She shrieked as she applied more. "Tam, Suri, Zuhal, Ditala!" she repeated. Tears filled her eyes as Dan lost consciousness. I had heard those words used before, for it was the same magic that Gareth performed, the same healing art that was used to save Fergus. Gareth was punished for using it at Tel Suma, for when used in reverse, it was a dark elf magic. It was something Kaylee Zy'stiri was much more familiar with than he, but Gareth succeeded. But after several attempts, Kaylee stopped her chant and then cried because Dan's body appeared lifeless. She was too late. Her hands were burned. Her acolytes tried to attend to it, but she sent them away. She lay beside Dan, crying, and then trying to prepare a defense for herself when the rest of the drow returned later from the battle that had been raging at Didak. Didak had been a bloodbath. Many of Zerlus's best fire giant guards were slain by both the summoned demons and vicious Gnoll army that guarded Didak. The giants slaughtered much of the Gnoll army. The fiercest of demons Quel had summoned was slain by King Zerlus himself. Others were sent back to their dimensions by the higher drow clerics. The Zy'stiri and other powerful drow houses lost many of their best fighters and clerics on that day. Kaylee's disappearance was definitely noticed. It appeared she would have a lot of explaining to do. But with Dan defeated and apparently dead, she was unsure which way to turn. She considered all possible paths for escape. Dan then gasped for air. He wrenched in pain as his graying arms' veins filled with dark green, life-restoring blood. He called out to her in great pain, just as the matriarch of the Oguata house called out for her as well.
Kaylee!
"Kaylee!" they both said, almost simultaneously. Kaylee motioned for her servants to lay in the bed with Dan, and they threw blankets over his face. She then stood up and left the bedroom, entering the outer foyer, to find a squad of angry and bloody drow waiting there with weapons drawn. Kaylee acted as nonchalant as possible. "How dare you enter my vestibule without my welcome?" The drow males were stunned by her boldness. Lacella Oguata was less impressed. "Where have you been? What was the meaning of that attack?" As powerfully charismatic as Lacella was, she dimmed to Kaylee in that most important regard. As Kaylee approached, she displayed it in her posture and walk, as well as in her words. "I told you, all of you, there will be no peace with Quel. Did you not see my own treacherous brother try to overrule his matriarch, his high priestess, your high priestess? How dare he? The death he was given was less than he deserved." She spoke louder and with more determination with each word. "I commanded my guard to kill him. When we were surrounded by Quel and his minions, I saw to our escape. You can thank Zaxtet I survived." There was a long, silent pause as Lacella considered her response carefully. "Of course, We are grateful, Lysella said, her own rage now defanged. Did you finish the job? Is Didok destroyed? Or once again, do I have to do that myself? We were outnumbered, High Priestess, one of the males chimed in meekly. Silence! Prepare the next attack. And stand guard. Alert the giants. They are coming. Yes, High Priestess. Yes, High Priestess. The squad replied in unison. Lysella watched as her coup posse of angry dark elves healed to Kaylee and collapsed so quickly around her. They all fell in line when confronted by the glorious rage of the most beautiful and ruthless of all the Drow High Priestesses. Kaylee would kill her own brother for daring to try and circumvent her authority. Dare any of they? No. Lysella's ambitions would have to wait. She fell in line with the rest of them and returned to her house. She prepared her army for battle, as ordered. The attack did not come. Not that day, or for several more to follow. Kaylee took credit for this, claiming the bastard summoner had learned his lesson. They and the giants could count on him not daring to make any more moves on the Golden Plateau, which he hadn't. Quel's forces had indeed taken a couple of terrible beatings, once with our surprise attack, aided by the mountain giants, and then this latest one. Every time Quel seemed to recover his forces, he was stepped on again, but even harder. Knowing Kaylee's Zy'stiri and the giants were now his enemies, and having just sustained a near-death attack by a new, unknown dark warrior beside her, Quel decided to remain below in Didok and keep a lower profile for a while. In the interim, just like Fergus, Dan healed slowly. The dark withering magic of the Scorn Scepter penetrated deep into the fabric of living tissue. This caused great pain during the healing process and required a lot of rest. Kaylee took unexpected pleasure in tending to Dan personally during these weeks. She had never cared for anyone before, and it made her happy to have someone in her life worth caring about. Caring was a strange and foreign emotion to the Drow, but while in Dan's presence, she did learn why humans love. Some days after, Dan finally awoke to hear Kaylee in the adjacent room. She was in her laboratory, repeating a phrase over and over. Dan sat up painfully, curious to hear what she was saying. He stood up for the first time in weeks. He was naked and emaciated. The wound on his shoulder was still painful, but both of his arms and hands were present and functional. Dan staggered to the laboratory, where Kaylee repeated her words again. Palip, shus selasos, metrial, she said, pointing two of her fingers in a peculiar fashion directly at the headstone of an amulet that rested on her table. The headstone popped out, totally unhindered by the metal clips or the magic incantation that had previously fused it there for over 200 years. Yes, she smiled and hollered ecstatically.
What are you doing?
Dan asked in a whisper. Kaylee turned to see Dan standing, her face filled with glee. Dan Tenuvio, my brave fighter, my only love, you're standing. You are talking. She raced over to him and inspected his arms and hands, kissing them and placing her fingers anxiously about his chin and cheeks.
Yeah, I'm all right. Feel like I was hit in the head by a boulder. But...
You've been sleeping for nearly 20 days. But you've survived. Dro had no expression like miracle, so she stammered to find the right way to describe her new feelings. Not expecting this, but very pleased. Very pleased.
Were you worried about me?
Dan asked, skeptical of her feelings. Again, this word meant nothing when not applied to battle strategy. No, not worried. I was confident the magic would work. I am very pleased. She smiled. Dan looked to the table and saw a pile of rings, amulets, and chains, opposite another pile of separated jewelry.
So what's all this? You've been repeating yourself for hours.
As Dan spoke, he reminded her of what she had been doing. Her eyes flared with excitement. This! I can do it! I'm certain I can.
That's great. You want to open a jewelry business? I mean, what do you...
Wait, watch, she said. She took another ring from the pile of intact jewelry. She looked at it, pointed her fingers back and forth, trying to determine her point of impact. Then she said it again. Palip, shus silasalos, metrial! She pointed her fingers into the gemstone of the ring, almost as if it were a pickaxe, and the gem popped out. She used her natural dexterity to catch it, after it had bounced once on the table. She then showed it to Dan, smiling. He was not impressed.
That's what you wanted to show me? That's like a barroom huckster trick.
I can do it. I'm sure of it. She smiled confidently in her discovery.
Well, that's wonderful. I'm sure you can too. I think I'm going back to sleep now.
Dan said, still very groggy and confused by her antics. Dan, you could not defeat Quel, she said coldly and matter-of-factly. Dan turned to her a bit offended, but obliged that he did not keep his word. But before he could offer any excuses, Kaylee spoke on. Not because he was a greater warrior, but because he wields a weapon of supernatural origin. Dan shrugged his shoulders and nodded. You cannot hope to battle the Scorn Scepter unless you too wield a weapon from the outer worlds.
Do you have one?
Dan's curiosity was now piqued. He felt the same kind of excitement, that tingle in his spine he would feel any time I shared the plans for a new, lucrative job to my Guild of Thieves. There is a place, not of this world, called Baron Brawl. It is a resting place for forgotten warriors. Dan's eyes perked when he heard the words Baron Brawl. That was the goddess Hela's purgatory, the place where those warriors who did not die gloriously in battle, but in shame, rested for all eternity. They had but one purpose, to earn their way to the halls of the heroes, by fighting and dying properly in battle. That was part of Dan's religious teachings. It was strange to hear it coming from Kaylee. She went on. There, amongst the endless throngs of the shamed, rests Silverrune, the greatest of swords on any world. The shamed have but one purpose, to guard and keep Silverrune from the hands of the living.
This sword actually exists? Can it be used? Can we get it?
Dan asked innocently. No man, beast, demon, or even god dare try to take Silverrune from its place in Hela's barren brawl, for she had cursed it with the Eye of Souls, the all-seeing one eye that rests at the base of its hilt. Anywhere the sword would be taken, the Eye of Souls would reveal to the army of the shamed, and they will come for it and return it to its rightful home. Endless numbers of deadly shadow warriors who lust for combat, afforded a way out of an eternity in barren brawl.
Then what can we...
Dan was confused. I've obtained this scroll. She unfurled the parchment, which looked somewhat familiar to Dan. The reason it did was because this scroll had been penned by Master Silas himself. Dan had seen it before, while Master Silas was bestowing the Girdle of Giant Strength to him. It was a scroll of knock magic, but heavily researched and penned by one of the greatest sorcerers to ever live. Silas had penned it for the White Flame, to use one day to open the gates of Zy'stiri, but Kaylee had obtained it from the dead body of Ozymandias, who had stolen it from Silas. Dan was oblivious to all of this at the time. He was only curious what she intended to do with it. This is powerful magic, penned by a powerful magic user. I believe if I point to it just right. She mimicked the test she had been repeating all morning. I can dislodge the Eye of Souls from the hilt. Her face was filled with smiles of personal satisfaction. Dan reflected on the plan as currently constructed.
Well, if we were to steal the sword,
Silveroon, greatest of all swords.
Yes, right. If we manage to steal Silveroon, remove the Eye of Souls from the hilt, what do we do then? Bury the eye?
No, there will not be much time. It will see wherever it is, and then it will travel through any space to return to the hilt and bring the endless army of the shame to find it and return it once again to Baron Brawl. Dan looked confused and disappointed. Kaylee then raced over to one of her secretive drawers in one of her many bureaus. She pulled out what looked like a small metal lamp. She placed it on the table and opened the latch door to it. Inside, the tiny box was ringed with mirrors, formed in a circle, cut to all sides, facing each other, reflecting into infinity. We put the eye in here, she smiled mischievously. It will never know where it is. She laughed at the brilliance of her plan and the creation of the lamp. When it looks for the location, it will only see itself and endless light and space, an abyss of its own ghastly reflection. The Eye of Souls will be blind to its location. So yes, we can use the sword.
We?
Dan asked. You can wield it. You can crush Quel. You can have your promised revenge, she said, caressing his body.
What if this doesn't work, and the Eye of Souls is not freed?
Dan asked innocently. As its wielder, you will have to spend an eternity freeing the shamed with it, or become one of them, she smiled. Her confidence fueled Dan's own. When it came to planning this heist, Dan was fortunate to have spent those 7 long years with me. He had plenty of experience in such strategies, whereas Kaylee expected to teleport into this dark astral space, grab it, and then teleport away. Dan offered there needed to be a distraction to ensure their escape, a bait and switch. There would be far too many defenders to expect to simply barge in, grab it, and flee.
Do you know what the sword looks like?
He asked. Only from these old drawings and archaic descriptions, she answered. She possessed several tomes of historical artifacts, containing all of the items of power the Dark Elves coveted for many centuries. The carefully scrolled image was not terribly helpful, but the description, when translated painstakingly, did add lore and did help provide enough facts for what Dan was looking for. A counterfeit. When in battle, Silveroon glows, and it buzzes, hisses, and crackles like a burning fire as it takes down its enemies. The more she described it, the more Dan wanted it.
Can you conjure something that looks, glows, and sounds like that?
Dan asked. Days later, when Dan felt well enough for the mission, they suited up and Kaylee showed him her creation. It was impressive, down to the moon's white glow and moving eye in the hilt. She also added the most minute details, its precise size and weight, and the indecipherable runes that were hewn into the sword before recorded time, giving it its name. Kaylee hid the counterfeit in an unremarkable covered sheath she wore on her back, given the size of the sword. Dan wore a dark cloak Kaylee had gifted him to help him achieve non-detection. It, like Thebes, possessed the ability to render its user invisible. Before she teleported them into a dangerous astral dimension, to an unseen location, using only a best guess for a compass, she wanted to kiss Dan's face again. "Do you serve me?" she whispered through her kisses.
Yes. for you have promised me my revenge. The gods have heard me.
Do you love me? She asked, unsure if she was saying it right. Dan looked into her eyes.
Always,
he said. They embraced, and she spoke the incantation. In an instant, they were in a separate time and space, a place both before time and after, a world only visited by the immortals and those for whom time does not matter. Barren Brawl was a desert of maroon rocks and endless mesas and buttes. The sky was cold, gray, and dark, for there was no sun here. Only starlight offered slight illumination on the rocky plains. There was no air to breathe, but Kaylee had prepared them both for astral travel, stalling their body vitals long enough to achieve this goal. They were essentially holding their breath, as if underwater. That added to the need to move fast, which they did. They could not speak to each other, so Dan was wise to create a detailed plan of action. Fortunately, Kaylee's navigational plot guess was nearly perfect. They arrived just outside of the sacred shrine of Hela. The shrine was constructed to house Silveroon atop one of the many open rock mesas. The light of Silveroon could be seen piercing through the spaces between the rocks, turning the gray clouds gold. Its spires covering several square miles of open nothing, where these forgotten fallen roamed without any other purpose. Dan approached the pathway to the summit. He ran as quickly as he could up the rocky staircase, barging his way at times through the throngs of the faceless fallen. Though invisible, Dan had increasing trouble making his way past them, as the mass-gathering bodies collected as he got closer. They were all pushing upwards along the stone path in a tireless effort to get ever closer to the object of their worship. Dan had to make a series of sudden pushes and rolls to manage his way through. For just like them, Dan was using every bit of his strength to get closer to the blade. Kaylee flew directly up to the top of the shrine. She made her presence known to all of the Forgotten, to witness her quite dramatically, using several small chemical explosions that created dark smoke clouds around the shrine. The sounds of the explosions startled the Forgotten momentarily, which was just enough. In one sudden move, she let herself be seen reaching for Silveroon, but rather than grab it, she cast a spell of invisibility upon it, while in her other hand, she removed the counterfeit sword from her sheath. She then emerged from the black smoke with the fake sword in her hands. The throngs of the Forgotten screamed and pointed their skeletal hands at her as she then flew away with it, levitating slowly above them, just out of their grasp. The army of the Forgotten then charged after her as she drifted away into the distance. Dan was then pinned to the walls of the passage that led to the top of the mesa, as hundreds of the Forgotten chased down the path after the apparent sword thief like an angry herd of bison. Many leapt straight off the mesa. They fell to the canyon floor and then dragged their broken bodies in her direction thereafter. Kaylee finally landed about a mile away, across a flat, lifeless desert. She continued to broadcast an abnormal amount of light from her position. As the stragglers made their way after her, she held Silveroon aloft for them to see. The army of the Forgotten charged angrily at full speed. She then thrust Silveroon into the rocky ground, piercing the canyon floor with a loud bang and tremendous tremor. Dan then made his way to the top of the mesa and into the shrine of Hela. There were still some of the Forgotten present in the shrine. One was the sword guard, who hadn't moved at all the whole time. He was in direct communication with the Eye of Souls, and there was nothing that caused alarm up to that point. The sword had not been moved. He was unconcerned with all the other sounds and activity. Dan leapt up onto the highest butte that might enable him to reach the magically suspended sword. When he climbed atop what he perceived to be the highest and closest point to the sword, he reached his arm out. He felt around unsuccessfully, for the sword was made invisible to him as well. A mile away, the army of the Forgotten closed in on Kaylee's position. She would need to move soon. Dan climbed back on top of a jutting stone. He was becoming increasingly dizzy. Dan reached up, trying to maintain his balance, but he could not feel the invisible sword. The army of the Forgotten then surrounded Kaylee and charged in from all sides. Dan then tapped what he felt was the bottom of the sword. The mass of shrieking rage came so close to Kaylee, she could see their discolored eyes. She could wait no longer. She used a dimension portal to spirit away from the charging army. She hid beneath a rock formation as the rest of the army surged on past her. Dan climbed even higher onto the jutting rock. He could feel his consciousness on this world failing. But he concentrated and reached up with both arms. He grasped the sword and held tight, which removed it from its fragile stand. Dan could not keep his balance, and as the sword was removed, he fell to the ground. He had lost control of it. Dan and Silveroon impacted on the ground simultaneously, both becoming fully visible. Silveroon cracked the stone floor as it struck, causing a loud crackle that echoed through the canyon. The army of the Forgotten reached the counterfeit, just as the real Silveroon called out to them. The sword guard was awakened. He called out to the others that the object of their reverence had been displaced. But his call sounded more like 1,000 wild boars shrieking simultaneously. It then made hasty steps directly towards the sword. Dan was now alone with just the sword guard. Silveroon had pierced the stone floor, its hilt there for the taking. Dan rolled and then sprinted for it. The sword guard tackled him along the way. As Dan reached for the sword guard pounded on his face mercilessly with several strong and angry blows. It then moved past him to recover the sword. Dan reached its ankle and then spun and grappled the sword guard. It extended its bony arms into his face firmly, kicking him violently with one knee. These Forgotten men were filled with near supernatural strength, for some waited centuries for one last chance to use all of their unspent violent anger in one inspired outburst. Even with his giant strength, Dan could not easily wrestle him aside. He grew dizzier as the sword guard lifted up both of its legs and kicked down on his shoulders, forcing him back. It then crawled closer to the sword. Dan looked to the shrine entrance and saw many more of the Forgotten ready to join the fray. Dan sprung to his feet and tackled the sword guard. They both landed on the sword. Dan managed to wrestle his way atop the sword guard and punched him with all his strength. Just then, 3 others collapsed on top of him. Kaylee flew past some of the Forgotten as they charged back towards the shrine. But she beat them to the pass, where she used illusions to hide the path to the top. But these Forgotten were drawn directly to the sword and would walk through walls if they had to get it. She flew up the pathway at top speed as the horde of the angry Forgotten chased behind her. When she reached the top of the mesa and entered the shrine, she saw a mass of about 12 Forgotten piled and thrashing at what must be Dan underneath. She prepared a magic bolt of lightning in an attempt to free him, but before she could finish the incantation, Dan emerged from the pile in a sudden explosive burst of power. He held Silveroon in his hands and turned and slashed and cut down the Forgotten with newfound ease. Kaylee then turned her bolt of lightning towards the charging Forgotten behind her, throwing the shocked and sizzled throngs into the approaching ones. Kaylee flew towards Dan as he hacked his way to the center of the shrine. His eyes met hers. They embraced as a vast army of angry Forgotten could be seen well into the horizon, charging at them from all sides. She kissed Dan and then spoke the words, teleporting them both away. Teleporting into the astral plane required a lot of preparation. She had to school Dan on the differences of realities and how they needed to never lose consciousness of their physical bodies. The teleportation magic had to be tweaked so that their essence and magic items would be transported only. They would be leaving their physical bodies somewhere, lifelessly, while away from our world. Therefore, Kaylee prepared for them to be left by a table in the laboratory. Only her most trusted of servants were privy to her state, but they remained in the room as ordered, awaiting their return. Dan remembered feeling the tremendous pull of the sword as he ported from the astral plane of Baron Brawl. He held it with all his might as he seemed to tear a hole in the fabric of time and space. When he returned to his body, the sword followed right after, splitting the large table in half, with Silveroon lodging into the stone floor beneath. Both he and Kaylee gasped as they came to. After the startled servants screamed out, Dan and Kaylee's eyes both turned to the exposed hilt of Silveroon and the green orb with its swirling eye, observing its location. Immediately the air was torn before them, and a Forgotten entered the room, reaching for the sword. Kaylee scrambled to her feet. Behind her, another rift in the sky opened, and then two others made their way through. Dan got to Silveroon first, and pulled the sword from the shattered table and stone. With 3 quick moves, he beheaded 2 of the Forgotten and cut the other in half. The sword sizzled as it cut. It felt incredible in Dan's hands, but he grew impatient as even more of the Forgotten had already followed them through the interdimensional portal.
Kaylee! Use the magic! What are you waiting for?
Dan asked as he fought off another. "It's here! Buried under the table!" she cried as she rifled through the wreckage, looking for the scroll she had left there. "I wasn't expecting you to smash it!"
Well, get it!
Dan said, as 2 others grabbed hold of him and tried to pry the sword from his grasp. "I am!" Kaylee's servants helped her as she desperately combed through the shattered wood and stone. She found the scroll as Dan collided with some of her other furnishings and experiments. She dusted off the paper, which fortunately was still intact. Silveroon blasted its way through several more Forgotten, sending light and electrified energy through the room as Dan hacked his way through them, trying to get closer to Kaylee. "Give me the sword!" she yelled.
What?
"Bring it here!" Kaylee demanded. "How can I free the eye without the sword?"
Fates be damned!
Dan yelled as he dropped another. He then tossed Silveroon to Kaylee. Several more pierced through the air and into the room moments after. Dan tried to wrestle them back. They tore, punched, and ripped his face with their clawed hands. Several more came through the passage, and the servants pinned themselves to the walls in terror.
Do it!
Yelled Dan louder, as he was tackled by a growing mob. "Palip, shus silasos, metrial!" When performed in such sheer desperation, Kaylee's odds of success dropped considerably. But all that mind-numbing practice came to fruition as the magic scroll lit up. Her fingers tapped the hilt just right, and the Eye of Souls sprang from the hilt. The eye bounced onto the ground, just as any eyeball might do, and Kaylee managed to snag it as 3 of the Forgotten tackled her. They ripped and tore at her body while she grasped the eye in her closed hand. The eye heated and burned her hand immediately. She called out in great pain, "Dan, it is done!" Dan had a momentary respite as the Forgotten men who had been beating on him realized they could reach the sword. About 7 Forgotten closed in on the sword at once. Dan sprung into action after them. One of the Forgotten grabbed the sword with pride and started to return it to Baron Brawl. The window in time and space opened behind him, but Dan grabbed the hilt with him and used all of his strength to prevent its return. He punched its face fiercely, which caused it to release Silveroon. Dan turned and swung. The sword's power cut through the air and the Forgotten as Dan struck them down, but they kept coming.
Where's the box?
Dan yelled in desperation. "I'm looking!" Kaylee yelled back as she fumbled with one hand through the table rubble, looking for the little metal box of mirrors. Finally, she found it. The eye smoked in her fisted hand and burned its way through her skin. She opened the box and cried out in pain as she released the eye into it. The burning, caused by the Eye of Souls, left a permanent burn mark of a single glaring eye upon her palm. When she closed the box, no more of the Forgotten appeared, but so many had made it in by then. It took a good 10 minutes of vicious melee before they could all be destroyed. When it was over, Dan collapsed beside Kaylee near the pile of table rubble. He was exhausted. She was in tremendous pain. But they both simply started laughing together.
Thanks so much for watching, everyone. If you haven't yet, please subscribe and ring the bell for notifications so you never miss an episode. Be sure to smash that like button and comment below. It helps a lot. If you'd like to help me get this book published, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter. And as always, be sure to share this story with all your friends on your favorite social media.